Dan Glenn has an idea that could help improve the profitability of the American cow herd when this cattle cycle ends.
I think the majority of people could be even more profitable if they bought their replacement females from somebody who put a lot of environmental pressure on their cow herd and saved females year after year after year out of that system, and then offered those for a fair price, in their community.
One piece of that is understanding that some terminal bulls are going to be better suited for certain tasks than others.
So there is a difference between a terminal bull that might go into a feedlot and a terminal bull that might produce calves to grass finish. Every environment can support probably a little different frame size from a grass finishing perspective. The better your grass is, the longer your grazing season, probably the more frame you can support.
All that and more on this episode 503 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by Ambrook.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Hi, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast. Very excited to be joined today by Dan Glenn of Deep Grass Graziers. And he's got an idea that I think has got quite a bit of merit to it as far as helping us prepare for the end of this cattle cycle that we are currently riding a high in and returning profitability back. By one thing that sets his idea apart is that we are not asking every producer to do everything. This is kind of a division of labor play where we're giving people the opportunity to say, hey, you stick to what you know, what you love, what you are the best at, and then let somebody else do the other parts that you need to be able to do what you're the best at. So not everybody has to raise their own replacements and some of those things. So I think it's an interesting idea. Looking forward to sharing this conversation with Dan Glenn with you right now. Dan, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast.
Thanks, Clay. Longtime listener and excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, glad to have you on in the providence of God. You sent me an email about a day after somebody had responded to a survey and said, you should have Dan Glenn on the podcast. So it's like, all right, perfect. We'll do it. And so,
well,
yeah,
it's great. So many of the folks you have on are people either in my network or one person away. And I enjoy listening, and I'm a lifelong learner, like probably so many folks. And so it's a great resource, and I appreciate the work you do and look forward to the future.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, to that end, I think you've got a unique perspective on maybe a way forward in the cow industry, and I'd like to hear kind of what you're thinking, how you're thinking about it from a regional perspective, and the way that because the industry is prone to fads, chasing fads, and I think like every industry probably, and so and that's had negative consequences. We've talked a lot about that on the podcast over the years, and finding cows that fit your environment. Well, the best way to do that is to get them from people who live in your environment, right? And it's on both ends, on the bull side and on the cow side. But I think we all agree here. The new logo, the Working Cows podcast, has a cow on it. And they are the ones that are going to be the ones that do the work and determine the profitability to a large degree, right? So what are you thinking as far as this strategy is concerned with cow development and some of those things?
I got into this from an outsider's perspective, and so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, get my head around cattle production, making my way from the cow back to the grass, then to the soil. And so, this raising cattle works when we have cattle that are efficient in their environment and they're adapted to their environment, because fertility drives the bus, right? The most important driver of profit is fertility. Therefore, cattle that come out of a southeast environment are going to are pretty much inclined to thrive in the Southeast. Cattle that are from Canada, cattle that are from the Southwest, all those cattle over generations have proven themselves, either proven or not proven themselves, to be environmentally adapted. And so, when you start moving cattle around from region to region, you find that a lot of those cattle are not going to do as well. So I think, as looking towards genetics and, either expanding our herd or, choosing our bulls, we really want to stay as close to home as possible. I think that's first and foremost. The other thing I think that is often overlooked is the power of heterosis. A lot of times breeders, including myself, we get kind of narrow focused on a certain breed for a certain purpose. And from a seed stock perspective, that can be good. We can create a lot of prepotency the more we line breed, but at the same time, from a commercial perspective, we really want to take advantage of heterosis because it's a free lunch. It's the only free lunch in the business, right? So what I see that would improve the bottom line of a lot of people when we get out of this crazy cow cycle we're in right now, when we start falling back to reasonable prices, we're really going to need to pay closer focus to fertility and pounds weaned per cow exposed. And I think one way we can do that is to think about using terminal bulls on cows that we might not raise on our farm, but we might get from producers in our region who specialize in maternal production. Right now, I'll, I don't know what the number is, but there's a lot of folks who kind of are trying to fit down the middle. And that's you can make that work. I mean, obviously a lot of people have made that system work where they give up a little growth for some maternal traits, and they're able to sell steers for a pretty good price, and they're able to make replacement females. But I think the majority of people could be even more profitable if they bought their replacement females from somebody who put a lot of environmental pressure on their cow herd and saved females year after year after year out of that system, and then offered those for a fair price, in their community. And that way, that allows, your most of the producers just to breed terminal, sell all the calves, and when you need replacements, go to that maternal breeder. But now, in order for that to work, we have to have a network of maternal breeders. And so that's what I hope over the next 10 years is that there's more and more of a marketplace for this type of thing where people are confident that they can get cows from programs that raise cattle like they want to raise cattle, or genetics that they, want to use as a base herd for their marketing efforts, whether that's going into a conventional feedlot or that's going into a direct market grass-fed beef program. And when discussing terminal, those are two different types of animals, right? There is a terminal type for grass finished beef, but there's also a terminal type for your standard, commercial outlet.
I want you to define a term for me. I probably should know the definition of this term, but prepotency. What's your definition of that? Or what is the
I would
definition of that?
describe that as the inclination to have likeness in the offspring.
Okay.
So as we concentrate genetics by line breeding, by breeding within a certain cow family, the more concentrated those genetics get, the more likely we are to have an outcome in the calf crop. Larry Lindenhart has just shown did some pretty intense line breeding over the years in order to create a good bit of prepotency. The Y Angus program in Maryland has been a closed program since the 50s. There's a tremendous amount of prepotency in those cow lines. So, and the advantages of prepotency is we're going to get a lot of consistency. So, an ideal F1 cow, so say an Angus Hereford cross would come out of two prepotent lines, two closed lines of Hereford and of Angus. So, just an incredible mama cow would be, that F1 Baldy that came out of two prepotent lines, because not only do we get the heterosis of those lines, but we have a little bit of consistency coming from each of those prepotent, those closed herd genetics.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. Yeah, it's something that probably I've heard more often than not described as evenness. There's just evenness in the calf crop. I don't know how you would necessarily say it, tightening the bell curve, broadening the bell curve, flattening the bell curve, whatever it is, just making it all look more consistent. And so, yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Our sponsor today is Ambrook, and I recently spoke to Evan, and he shared two examples of how Ambrook is helping him better manage his operation.
When I first saw Ambrook, my first thought was, wow, every farm I've ever worked on should be using this. In large part because just like it always felt like the dark horse in those operations, many of which were diversified operations, was enterprise level visibility into where are we making money and where are we losing money. And so often it felt like, the sort of the missing link there was like we would do X if only we knew how much Y was costing us. Or we would love to start this other practice that we've heard about, but we just don't know enough about our finances in order to launch that. So, like I can keep my grazing records, I can keep my grazing charts, and I can see my animal unit days that I'm getting from a specific field. And then I can match that up with, profitability that I'm seeing in Ambrook on a specific field. And I can see, specific expenses associated with that field, especially as we think about like, how do we actually measure our success in a regenerative system? In part, like it has to be financial. And so like if you're doing particular practices on a specific field, I feel confident in now my ability to like be able to observe what's going on in that field, like ecologically and biologically, and with the performance of my livestock. But I also like have the analytical tool in Ambrook to observe the financial tracking of that and the financial success of that field.
If you want to learn more, you can check out ambrook.com/workingcows. One of the things I was listening to you on the Acres USA podcast just before we started recording here, and one of the things that you were talking about on there is the difference in regions and how different cows are going to work in different regions. But it does seem to me that when any region puts pressure on a cow, we end up with a frame score 4 cow that weighs 11 to 1,200 pounds, and there's a lot of these similarities, right? What are the differences? What makes a cow work in South Georgia that, she'll be maybe similar in shape or something, but different in Western South Dakota?
Yeah, each region has its challenges, and I have friends all over the country. And when I go to their place, I think, "Wow, it's really hard here in January," but wow, it's really cool here in April. So yes, you're exactly right. So the Southeast, especially where we are in Bahia country, so we're in Bahia Bermuda country, we have really low energy grasses that also can be washy because of our rainfall. We get 45 to 60 inches of rain a year. Some places, will get even more than that. They'll get 55 to 70 inches. So not a lot of strength to those grasses. And a cow needs a good bit of capacity, a good bit of ruminability and capacity in order to be able to process, to eat to get the energy they need. So, the ideal cow in our region is going to be, that smaller frame size, like you say, probably a 4 to 4.5 is about what I would like. But she's going to have a big middle. Whereas, if you were in the Southwest and, you had one cow to 100 acres, she might have a little more leg on her. She might be a little rangier. Her muscle to fat ratio might look a little different. Whereas if you were in northern Alberta, that cow's probably going to be a little bit bigger. It's probably going to have to put on more fat in order to make it through the winter. And so there are nuances to every environment for sure.
Yeah.
But you're right that I do think that, and I think, that northern Alberta cow, she might be 1,300 pounds. That might be the ideal weight. I think, the colder the climate, the richer the grass, the harder the grass, I think it's going to be able to support a little bit bigger cow.
Right, but what we know for sure is that she's not gonna weigh 1,800 to 2,000 pounds and win the show, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
And really that a lot of that, I think a lot of the influence of that, a lot of why all those things have gone the way that they've gone is because, everybody is making an animal that's adapted to the feedlot and desirable to the the packers, right? I mean, is that kinda how you see that too?
Yeah, absolutely. As EPDs became a thing, I think we've been sold a little bit of a bill that these terminal traits, which can be useful, right? I mean, wean and weight, yearling weight, frame size. I mean, all these things, they're information. But the problem is when we don't disconnect the fertility and the feed cost of the mama cow from the end product. And so I think as ranchers, if we want to be profitable, we've got to figure out what is the ideal size and type of mama cow that's going to get bred on time every year for a decade or more. And those are the cows that are going to make us money. Those are the cows that we can still create a product that the packers are going to make money on. I think there's some middle ground there between, having that 1,800-pound mama cow, and us, still having, above 90% fertility rates.
Yep. Okay. So in your ideal world, the kind of what you laid out here as we got started today was that people would be developing these mama cows, and then going out and finding a terminal bull to put over top of these mama cows. Now, I just want to check and make sure, um, or have you maybe lay out your process for developing these mama cows that are going to be more maternal than not? What does that look like? I mean, we've talked about this quite a bit, and I just am making sure that the process is consistent,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
you're challenging them, and yeah, what does that look like?
It's as little as off-farm inputs as possible while still providing them with enough energy and nutrition to get grown in a reasonable amount of time. So, it looks more like supplemental feeding, as opposed to substitute feeding. And, we have kind of learned the hard way that, a cow has a nutritional requirement. You can't ask them to be miracle workers, and as we push fertility, we've gotten cows bred at 50% of their body weight, probably adult body weight, probably less. But what we found is that there's higher dystocia rates at calving.
Mm.
They struggle to get bred back. They struggle to raise a good first calf. And so there's a sweet spot, depending on what your forage program is, about getting those cattle, those heifers up to, a weight where they can raise a decent first calf, and get bred back on time. I'm not asking them to raise, a calf like a 5-year-old is going to. If they do that, we are substitute feeding them. We're doing something. We're propping up their environment. So we don't expect to get 90 or 95% of our heifers bred yearly. There should be some fallout because otherwise we're not selecting, cows that are going to thrive. So it's a little bit of a dance, right? And I think year after year we try to refine it to get it right. We try to put as many growing forages in front of those cows. Recently one thing we've done which has helped. I was always under the belief that leaving those heifers and those bulls on the cows longer is better for their maturation process, and their maturity. Obviously there's a lot of learned behavior that happens, watching their mom, watching the herd. But one issue we have in our program, in our environment, is as we were calving February, March, even into April some, and now we're starting to back it up a little bit. But we were leaving those cows on, almost till December, November, December, and what we found is those starting around September, October, our perennial grasses to a slow decline, and our cows are just barely hanging on, and our calves are not gaining weight, because they're still being asked to eat those perennial grasses, and they're getting that tiniest amount of milk from their moms. Their moms are losing nutrition, or losing condition in first going on second trimester, calves are sitting still. So the last 2 years, we have weaned those cows around kind of what people would call a typical time, maybe somewhere between 6 and 8 months. And we put them on stockpiled annuals. So we've had sorghum Sudan, pearl millet, sun hemp, cowpea, uh, okra, crabgrass, and that has actually been a good improvement from both directions. Our calves, hang on and grow a little bit during that really fall slump. Fall is our kind of our hardest time to put weight on cows, but also our mamas dried off and rebuilt condition even on that poor grass because once they dry off it's their lowest nutritional requirements of their cycle. So that's been something that's been real successful for us. It took us a minute to figure it out, but we're pleased with it. Now it's just a matter of refining to have enough of those standing annuals, to get us to our winter annual program. And we're not quite there yet, but we're just still trying to manage our acreage and our cow numbers in order to figure that out.
Sure. Yeah, like ranching for profit would tell you, you can't starve profit into the business, but you can sure feed profit out of the business. So it's kind of both, you know, hitting that sweet spot like you're talking about, right?
Absolutely.
So, okay, so that's the cow side of it, the cow development side of it, and then the terminal bull side of it. That the scenario you laid out to start. That terminal bull doesn't necessarily mean different color, different breed. It just means. Well, let me ask you: does it mean simply more growth, more prone to growth, more of those kinds of traits, or what are you thinking of when you talk about breeding these maternal cows to a terminal bull?
We start with our customer and we work our way back. So if we're selling truckload lots to a certain feedlot or a buyer, we know what they want. If we're selling all these calves, we should know who they're going to or who we want to market to. So I think we start there. In a perfect world, we do have a third breed because of the amount of heterosis that's involved. If we put a third breed bull on an F1 cow, we can have 24% more pounds of calf wean per cow exposed. So that is not chicken scratch. So I do think, but if our customer doesn't want, a calf that color or doesn't want that breed for their feed program, then that's a problem. So ideally, yes, we maximize heterosis with our breed selection, but also we don't neglect who our customer is and what our goals are in producing that product.
Will some of these or a certain percentage of these terminal crosses still be ones that can go finish on grass? Would you say that's true?
Yeah. So if we are, I live mostly in a grass finishing world where all my steers are backgrounded and weaned and go into a nationally branded grass finished beef program. All my females are most, 80% of those are retained and exposed, and we see the ones that are going to make the cut and sell those as bred heifers, and we try to push the females that don't make the cut into a grass program as well. So there is a difference between a terminal bull that might go into a feedlot and a terminal bull that might produce calves to grass finish. Every environment can support probably a little different frame size from a grass finishing perspective. The better your grass is, the longer your grazing season, probably the more frame you can support. So when choosing terminal bulls for grass production, I think we have to keep the frame size. I mean, ideally, probably 5 or below. And we want to, create cows that are going to put on a lot of meat and muscle and early maturity, ideally, and have some grass carcass traits. A lot of the old line Angus cows are pretty good at that. The further you go back, the more those animals were finished on grass, and that's how we got into our business. We started with old line Black Angus, Wide, Pine Bank, Woodstone, and then slowly, and then we moved into the Red Angus world with some of the more heat tolerant Beckton and Buffalo Creek lines. And then the more we paid attention, the more we realized that, those old line Angus cattle, that man, they are great from a terminal grass finished beef production. We had some cows go prime on grass down here. I mean, no problem. But those females, the further back you go towards the British Isles, the more likely they are to struggle in South Georgia. They weren't bred here for
Right.
hundreds of years. So that's when we started doing some crossbreeding with Centipole and more recently Beefmaster to try to create some of those F1 females that we think would benefit our customers, that they could use in a commercial setting or in a direct market or grass finish setting.
Sure. And what are you currently marketing? What kinda do you guys have up for offer?
We, it's still predominantly probably Angus, Red Angus, Hereford Cross. Um, when I came home, my grandfather had more of a conventional program that had Sim Angus, a little bit of Brangus. So we've also been breeding those cows down and trying to put some more carcass and maternal traits in those cows. But the future for us is probably the F1 Centipole Angus, F1 Centipole Red Angus. We're still comparing what the half blood beef masters look like compared to those half bloods. But I think Teddy Gentry, who created the South Pole breed, was onto something with those breed combinations. I just think I can do it cheaper, with the first F1 cross, and I don't think we're giving up a lot by using those two breeds. So we'll see. We've got some quarter blood Centipoles that I really like as a lot as well. But I think the further we get down the line, the more we'll know about what really works on our place under our management.
Sure. Yeah, what are some of the challenges or things that you guys are working on now? I mean, you mentioned the earlier weaning. That was one of the more recent adaptations. What are some of the things that you're looking at now?
We're still, so I said, by putting pressure on these cows in an environment that's pretty tough, we still, those heifers are still, it's taken them longer to get grown. We really don't see kind of a full sized, 100% calf until they're about their third calf. And I want to get that down to probably their second calf. And so, um, we have three locations. One location, we have all our registered black and red Angus cattle running as a group. We have one location that has all our commercial cows and a lot of times where our weaned calves are. And then we have another herd that is another location that is all our young cows. So we take all our keeper heifers, we take all, the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds, and they all run together. So it's a matter of, getting that herd size dialed in to our land base and, figuring out exactly how to maximize annual usage to get those cows the nutrition they need without, bringing in, a feed truck to get there, because we want, nature to sort them. But at the same time, we don't want to, if you put too much pressure on cows, you'll make them too small. You'll take the milk out of them. You can select for that, but it won't work for the majority of people. And so we're trying to balance that line between, creating cattle that are environmentally adapted and tough to a cow that's still gonna wean and a market acceptable calf to a majority of customers.
And where would people go if they were wanting to get a hold of some of these genetics from you? How'd they go about doing that?
So our business is Deep Grass Graziers. We have been private treaty for the past 10 years, selling year round, both females and bulls. We made the decision, because of the hot cattle market, our business has exploded over the last 2 years. And that has led me to realize that we do a lot of labor trying to put together cow groups individually for people, which we've done for the past 2 years. They might want some out of the registered herd, some out of the young cow herd, matching calves, cows, getting them all weaned, separated. That has proven to be, a lot of work. So we made the decision the end of last fall to have our first sale coming up this April. So April 7th and 8th, we're going to have an online DB auction bid off sale where we'll have bulls, we'll have some pairs, we'll have some fall breds, and we'll have some open heifers. We haven't exposed our heifers yet, but I'm going to pull just a handful of heifers out for folks who might want some opens. And then, I think the plan is to have 2 sales a year. So we'll also have probably our bigger sale in September because we'll have all our bred heifers available then. So hopefully it goes well. I think we built our customer base up to the point now where we do have enough folks to do that. I love this format. I think the online bidding really can benefit both the producer and also the buyer. One of the cool things about this bidding process is if you bid in order and you've got 2 bulls there and you let the first one go because you kind of wanted the second one, and then the second one, the price goes and you don't get him bought, you can't go back and bid on the first one. Whereas, with this format, it makes it so that you can go back and bid on anything you want. Because as it closes, it goes up in 5-minute increments, 4-minute increments, whatever it is, until someone doesn't bid. Now that's the frustrating part. And I told DV Auction, I was like, man, y'all should make those increments adjustable, because I would just as soon it be a 2-minute increment or a 3-minute increment that, after 30 minutes or an hour, it goes down to a 1-minute increment. Because I've been on those sales where I'm like, all right, would somebody stop bidding, please? But while it's imperfect, I do think that it can work really well, like I said, for both buyer and seller.
Our sponsor today is Ambrook. And I spoke to Evan recently, and he shared that Ambrook is really giving him the confidence he needs to make important decisions on his farm.
And in complete honesty, I am not at the point yet where I feel confident that I can say definitely going to invest in this and definitely going to stop investing in that. But what does feel really good is the ability to just know that I'm doing that work. And, it's sort of like high school and college. I was an athlete, and it's all about trusting the process, right? And so much of ag feels like a faith-based process where you're trusting what you're doing is working to some extent based on the knowledge that you have. And I've always felt that farmers have really good gut instincts around what's working for their operation and what decisions they should be making. But so often it's just hard to have the data to, really inform those decisions. And for me, it's Ambrook as a tool that by a continued use of it and by a continued practice of using it, I will be able to get that data so that when it comes time for me to need to make those decisions, I'll have the data to back them up.
He also talked about how it's simplifying his direct-to-consumer business.
As someone who is primarily doing direct to consumer, having sort of a decentralized financial platform that I can, run off my laptop and my phone and essentially run myself feels like a really powerful thing. One of the benefits, I guess, of farming in the 21st century, where I can make invoices on my phone, and when I'm dropping off my direct to consumer lamb, I can just send them an invoice right off my phone. And, quite frankly, that was something my dad and my grandpa didn't have access to. And so, that feels like an advantage in today's day and age, having the ability to have access, make my customers' lives easier too.
If you want to learn more, you can check out ambrook.com/workingcows. And then on the other end of this conversation and what do we do with these heifers that fall out and how, what are some more profitable ways to think about turning that industry around. What is kind of your perspective on that, as far as I think there's a big interest in direct marketing, as I mentioned, in the middle of a survey process of the Working Cows audience, and I think right now 3rd or 4th among enterprises listed is direct marketing, which kind of surprised me, that it would be that high. And so there's obviously a lot of interest in it, a lot of people interested in it. A lot of the influencers, if you want to use that term in our industry, are doing it. And so I think it makes it more attractive to other people too. But what are some of the challenges of that business as you see it, and ways to help mitigate those challenges?
Yeah, one of my passions and one of the reasons we shifted from kind of this commercial production system to grass-based genetics was my interest in grass-finished beef. You know, the health components, it seemed like it seems like cows were put on earth to graze, right? And so we sourced the genetics, we brought them in. You know, we were in the process of having a relationship with a pretty big, you know, nationwide company, and then the last cow cycle happened, and prices went screwy, and we were a relationship kind of went bad that was on a handshake, and we launched a direct market grass finished beef business. I didn't get in this to be a direct marketer, but I had 60 finished steers on my hands, and I wasn't about to take them to the local stockyard. And we found this business. My wife and I, launched this brand. She helped me build the website and the brand, and we made it work. What I found was, just personally, is that wasn't a part of the business I enjoyed. And then in order for it to be successful, somebody needed to be passionate about it and needed to be somebody's job, especially when you start talking about volume. So after doing that for a few years, I was already in the genetics world, and so I just shifted my focus to genetics for this industry. And because of that, I'm exposed to a lot of people who are interested in grass finishing and direct marketing. And I would say 75% of my client base are people who direct market beef, mostly grass, but some corn as well. And the one thing, and it didn't really strike me until this last cow cycle. And with calf prices, you know, tripling over the past 10 years, doubling easy,
Oh
but
yeah, no,
potentially
that's
tripling in
tripling
some
is not
ways.
an exaggeration. I think we were,
Yeah.
$900 selling those, 600-pound steer calves for $900. Not that long ago, and I don't think it's out of the question to say that some of those have gone for $2,700 in the last year and a half. So yeah, tripling I don't think is out of the question.
Yeah, that it's gone crazy. And
Yes.
so it has made me really think hard about the grass finished beef supply chain. Um, and the reason I have confidence in saying this what I'm about to tell you is because I have finished 7-year-old cows, 3-year-old cows, 6-year-old cows. We've taken them out of the pasture. Sometimes they're already finished, full brisket fill. You know, they just basically were open for a long enough period of time. I didn't do anything special to them. We slaughtered them. We put them in our freezer, and it was some of the best beef I've ever eaten.
Mhm.
Um, so to say that, I would challenge folks, and this is the thing I do. I tell people, I was like, if you are trying to buy a $2,500 steer or $2,400 steer, and you have plans, it's going to take you 12 to 16 to 18 months after you purchase that steer in order to finish him, depending on what his weight is and how long. And then you're going to have a premium product. He's going to be, under 30 months. He's going to have a good dressing percentage. He's probably going to be tender, relatively tender. So there's a lot of advantages to that, right? But are you getting enough premium to select for that animal and that time frame and the amount and the slow turnover rate that you'll have tied up in that animal versus potentially having a neighbor who only grass feeds his cows, who raises replacement heifers or has, a young cow herd, that you are able to go into his herd, pay, and I just looked at prices today, pay 1,500 to 2,200. This is my region. Your region might be a little higher, but a lot of times the undervalued cows in my region are the smaller frame cows, are the lighter fleshed cows. So you have the opportunity to spend $2,000 on that animal, and if they're open, and if as long as you keep a bull off of them, they're going to compensate quite well. They're going to finish, in anywhere from 3 to 6, maybe 8 months at the most. And you've got less than half the cost in the finishing process of that animal. So there's a real value there. And I don't think the difference in the quality, I don't think we're getting enough of a premium to differentiate the difference in quality, because I would argue that, your dressing percentage on a female might not be quite as good. And your tenderness might not be quite as good if you're talking about a 3, 4, 5, 6 year old cow. But how many cuts actually do we notice with tenderness? We might notice the strip, we might notice the sirloin. Oftentimes the ribeye has enough fat quality in it, especially with the type of genetics we use, that we don't really notice that much of a difference. And so there's very few cuts in the animal that I think tenderness is a big deal. So
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think it scratches a lot of itches for the industry, right? First of all, like you said, this model isn't for everybody. I think that a lot of people get in. I've said this 100 times, but a lot of people that get into this business get into it not for the people side of it, and direct marketing is going to be a very people focused business, and you're going to deal directly with customers, and you're going to handle customer feedback and complaints and fulfillment and all of these things, right? And developing that list of people that want to shop at your, from you. And so um we can find that person who's interested in that. Like you said, it needs to be somebody's passion and their focus in their job. You can find that person who's interested in it, and they can take it and go from there. And then the other end of that is there are guys and gals out there doing great work raising these cows on forage, and have an animal that will grass finish and that is exposed only to forage, but don't want to or don't have the margin to pursue building a grass finishing business. And they're going to take those undervalued cows and they're going to sell them, and they're going to get the undervalued price rather than maybe a small premium that still works for the finisher, right?
it's an incredible way to upcycle a product that otherwise in the past has not been valued in the traditional marketplace. So it can really create a lot of value for many producers on both sides, on the seller side, but also on the finisher side. So I do think it's something that I hope more people, and just like if you're not in, if you haven't experienced the system, try it for yourself. Try an animal and compare it, and see what you think. I think that's the first step.
Yeah, I think there's actually a word for it, vaca vieja, right? That literally means old cow, and
Mm.
it is a more desirable animal in some parts of the world than actually the young Finnish steer. So, there's going to be a certain group of people out there who are interested in that and are seeking it out, and so I think that is another thing to consider, right?
And and that's a good point, and let's not neglect the fact that forages affect the flavor of beef. And so, um, I'm not necessarily advocating just taking an animal that's been on Bahia grass all summer and killing her in September and it be as premium a product as a steer someone finished on oats and ryegrass, in my region. So, but I am saying that, if you apply the same, type of forages and quality forages, you can get an animal that people will really enjoy. And that's right. Those older animals typically they've had longer to deposit fat over the years. The meat flavor is going to be typically richer. And so depending on what your customer is looking for, do they only value tenderness or do they like, a full flavored product? It depends on your protocols. So.
Right, and then you can tailor that and say, I bought this from this place and this is what she was, and she's older, or here's the younger animal, that also is available, and sell directly to those people who are interested in those things. I think it's a great idea.
Yep.
Are there animals that classes of animals? You mentioned a couple of them, but classes of animals that you think will better fit this, that'll be good candidates for something like this?
Well, the British breed cattle in general typically, a lot of the Angus, Red Angus, Devon, lots of those Red Pole, even some of the Herefords, but they tend to deposit fat pretty easily. And so I think animals that, marble and deposit fat are typically pretty good at this. And then, again, it goes back to your customer base and what they're expecting. But I think uh, and there's I think there is a little bit of science on the muscle fibers, and how some cattle have different muscle fibers, and so they might be a little more tender as they age than others. I've always heard that Highland, the Highland breed, had a little different muscle fiber and was pretty tasty. We won't be having any Highlands down here in South Georgia, but for all those of you north of North, it might be a good choice.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Interesting thing I learned actually quite a while ago now, but uh, one of lady pointed out that they were using Highlands for grass finishing, and she said that the horns are actually part of their heat mitigation strategy. And then I was oddly enough at Disney with my family taking a little tour ride that they had, and they said the same thing about the Watusi cattle, that those great big thick horns are actually
Mhm.
a honeycomb structure inside, and that's part of how they dissipate heat. And I'm like, oh, maybe this is just a pattern that horned animals, that's part of their heat mitigation strategy, and then we go and try and make everything polled or dehorn them at branding time, and now we've cut off their ability to mitigate heat, right?
I have heard that as well, and I've wrestled with it because we just started crossbreeding with Beefmaster, and we have a handful of purebred Beefmasters, and so we have a handful of horned calves, and there are disadvantages to having horned calves, but at the same time, I struggle with with actually just cutting them completely off because I recognize that God gave them those horns to be able to make it in the heat. It's just our buyers don't want it because they can injure each other in transit. So yeah, I haven't figured out exactly how we're going to manage that. Um, Not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Always another angle to consider, right? And pursue
Mhm.
for sure. So, are there more things on the finishing of open heifers and maybe even older cows and making that kind of a channel from which people could acquire animals that they could grass finish? Is there more to that you would like to
Well,
speak to?
the main thing I would say is and the key challenge is probably knowing when you have a season to finish cows on forages. So like for us, that season is like February, March, April, May. I mean,
Mm.
like if I could finish a cow on grass, it would be on winter annuals here. Every region has its time period. For a lot of places, that's probably the spring and summer. But for hot weather land down here, our winter annuals are the time. Now, you may or may not be able to acquire those animals during that time period, and so I think managing when those cows are available, and when ideally you have the forages is to finish them, or maybe you just have a bridge to get to your finishing window. That all needs to be put in the calculator, and those costs need to be considered. But I do think let's not undervalue, the what they're eating over their last 60 to 90 days and how that affects the flavor profile. So I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, and the cow being unique in that, as far as other protein sources or maybe not other ruminants, but certainly like pork and chicken and some of those things, you can slow them down and speed them up, as far as that finishing timeline is concerned, and maybe you get them when they're available and just rough them through on some grass, and then when finishing time hits, then you take them to finish. It
That's
would
right. I think that's how I would go about it. The main thing is getting the right animals,
Yeah.
and then as long as you don't have to keep them around for too long before that time period is in, that would be ideal because getting those animals that are near where from a genetic perspective, from an age perspective, from their history, all those things are really important. So I do
Yeah.
think that that's the middle ground.
It's all gonna come down to relationships and finding those people who are doing things that fit your system, and then and saying, "Hey, rather than hauling them to the sale barn and taking a discount, let me know when you got some."
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, and just I mean, you saying that made me think, maybe that's what we need. We need some type of network, a regional network where people know, when we're when we're going to be preg checking, what our protocols are. Maybe that looks like something that lives online that folks can see, maybe a regional map. That would be a good tool to be able to connect people, not only from the getting females to finish perspective, but also potentially from the maternal cow herd side. So um, maybe someone out there listening is interested in that as a business model. I'd pay probably a small subscription for every animal you found a home for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that is we're in the land of opportunity as far as finding those, developing those relationships and networks. And unfortunately or fortunately, whatever you want to say, Facebook Marketplace and all these other places, they wouldn't let you do that with trading livestock and those kinds of things. You have to be very creative with your titling or whatever, and so if there was a platform purpose built for it, that might present some good opportunities for sure. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Well, obviously we could talk for a long time today, Dan, but I just wanted to thank you for your time and your thoughtfulness and the, kind of the perspective that you brought to just some different challenges and overcoming those challenges. So
And enjoy the discussion, Clay. Thank you so much for having me.
thank you. Very good stuff there. I really appreciate Dan and him taking the time to come and share that idea and kind of the way that it fleshes itself out. And of course, if you're interested, you can check out what they've got going on there at deepgrassgraziers.com, and you can join them for their inaugural sale coming up April 7th and 8th on DV auction. More information at deepgrassgraziers.com. Coming up next on the Working Cows podcast, we're going to talk Jimmy Stewart, contrasting two radically different environments here and two guys that have put pressure on cows to develop cows that work in their environment. Jimmy up in Wyoming and Dan, of course, down in Georgia. And really just interesting to get those two perspectives so close to each other on the podcast. So look forward to sharing that conversation with you coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.